He swore an oath to serve. To protect his country, his fellow soldiers, and the honor of the uniform. He trained for battle, prepared for war, and stood side by side with men who would lay down their lives for him, just as he would for them. Loyalty was the foundation of everything. Trust was not just expected, it was essential. Without it, a unit could crumble. Without it, lives could be lost. But what happens when that trust is not just broken, but weaponized? On a quiet military base, where discipline is law and every soldier is bound by duty, an unseen enemy was working in silence. No weapons were drawn. No alarms were sounded. No shots were fired. And yet, one man was about to become the victim of a deliberate attack, one that he never saw coming. It started with fatigue. A few sleepless nights. A cough that wouldn't go away. Minor things. Things that could be brushed off. Things that didn't seem like warning signs. Until the weight loss became impossible to ignore. Until the pain set in. Until the doctors called him in for tests. And then, with a single sheet of paper in his hands, Major Desmond Tate's entire world came crashing down. The numbers, the words printed in cold black ink, told a truth that was impossible to accept. He wasn't just sick. He had been infected. But this wasn't an accident. This wasn't a tragic mistake. Someone had done this to him. A fellow soldier. A man he once mentored. A man he trusted. This was premeditated. Calculated. An attack unlike anything the army had ever seen. And by the time Desmond realized the truth, it was already too late. Who would do something like this? And why? This is the story of a soldier's revenge. A betrayal so ruthless, so deliberate, that it left an entire military base reeling. By the end of this video, you'll see just how far someone was willing to go, to destroy the man who once called him a brother. Year, 2018. Timeframe, May to October, 5 months of calculated revenge. Location, Fort Bragg, North Carolina, a base of honor, discipline, and secrecy. Fort Bragg wasn't just another military base. It was a city within itself, sprawling barracks, endless training grounds, and a hierarchy built on structure, loyalty, and order. This was the backbone of the U.S. Army, a place where warriors were forged, where men became brothers. But within the chain of command, respect was both earned and enforced. And when it was lost, consequences followed. The men at the center of it all. The victim, Major Desmond Tate. At 41 years old, Major Desmond Tate had built a career on discipline, leadership, and the kind of unshakable presence that made soldiers stand at attention the moment he entered a room. He wasn't just a commanding officer, he was a mentor, a guide, the kind of man who expected nothing but excellence from those under him. His reputation was solid. His men respected him. His superiors trusted him. Outside the base, Tate was a family man. A devoted husband to his wife, Camille. A father to 2 children, ages 10 and 13. He balanced the pressures of military life with the responsibilities of home, carrying the weight of both with the same sense of duty. He had seen deployments, led missions, and made decisions that most civilians would never understand. But of all the battles he had faced in his career, none would compare to the one that was coming. Because this time, the enemy wasn't overseas. He was standing right beside him. The suspect, Sergeant Xavier Holloway. To those who knew him, Sergeant Holloway was a contradiction. He had all the makings of a great soldier, sharp, physically strong, and undeniably intelligent. He had climbed the ranks quickly, earning a reputation as a fierce competitor in training exercises, a man who never backed down. But beneath that hardened exterior, something else lingered. Holloway had ambition. He wanted more than respect, he wanted power. And when he felt that Major Tate had taken that from him, the resentment festered. The tension between the two men didn't happen overnight. It built, slow and steady, over time. At first, Tate saw promise in Holloway. He pushed him harder, gave him more responsibility, spoke his name in rooms where promotions were decided. But when Holloway began making reckless decisions, when he started cutting corners, Tate had no choice but to step in. A report was filed. A disciplinary action followed. And with that, Holloway's dreams of a promotion were crushed. He was due to move up in rank, to finally reach the next level in his career, but Tate's decision put an end to that, at least for the foreseeable future. Holloway took it personally. And from that moment on, the once close mentor-protégé relationship turned into something else entirely. Something dangerous. Captain Malik Richardson, a trusted friend of Major Tate. The two had trained together, deployed together, and built a bond that extended beyond military life. When Tate started falling ill, it was Richardson who first noticed that something wasn't right. Specialist Elijah Carter, a young soldier with a sharp eye. He was lower-ranking, but observant. And in the weeks leading up to Holloway's ultimate betrayal, Carter saw something he couldn't explain: conversations held behind closed doors, medical visits that didn't add up, and a growing sense that something in their unit was deeply wrong. It started small. A warning. A conversation that should have been nothing more than a disagreement. "Stay in your lane, Sergeant." Tate's voice was calm but firm. The kind of tone that left no room for argument. "This is the Army, not a free-for-all." Holloway's jaw tightened, his hands balled into fists at his sides. He didn't argue. He didn't push back. He simply nodded, took a step back, and saluted. But as he turned on his heel and walked away, something in his eyes shifted. The grudge had taken root. And once it did, there was no turning back. Over the next few weeks, Holloway's demeanor changed. He wasn't outright defiant, he was too smart for that, but there was something different about him. A quietness. A focus. A precision in the way he moved. It was subtle, but the shift was there. And soon, it would become clear that every step he took was part of a plan. By the summer of 2018, something had changed in Sergeant Xavier Holloway. His fellow soldiers noticed it first, the subtle but undeniable shift in his demeanor. He had always been intense, but now there was an edge to him, something simmering beneath the surface. He avoided group settings. He rarely spoke to Tate unless duty required it. And when he did, there was no trace of the old respect he once held for his superior. His words were short, clipped. His stare lingered just a moment too long, carrying something unspoken, something no one could quite put their finger on. "Holloway's got a chip on his shoulder," Specialist Elijah Carter muttered one evening in the barracks. A big one. It wasn't just his attitude. There were whispers, rumors about meetings Holloway was having off base. Late-night drives. Unfamiliar faces. Conversations that ended the moment someone else entered the room. One name kept surfacing. A woman known around Fayetteville. A woman with a reputation. At first, it was just gossip, idle talk passed between soldiers in the mess hall. But then, one of them recognized her. She had been seen with Holloway more than once, slipping into his car outside a bar just outside base limits. She was known to be HIV positive. Desmond's health begins to decline. By August, Major Desmond Tate wasn't himself. It started with exhaustion. He chalked it up to stress, long hours, too many responsibilities, the weight of command pressing down on him. But then came the weight loss. The night sweats. The persistent cough that wouldn't go away. His wife, Kiera, noticed it first. "You need to get checked out," she told him one evening as he sat at the dinner table, barely touching his food. "Something's off." Desmond brushed it off. He had never been the kind of man to run to the doctor over minor discomfort. But as the weeks went on, the fatigue became unbearable. Training exercises left him breathless. His uniform hung looser on his frame. Something was wrong. Holloway had every reason to resent Tate. But was this about the lost promotion, or was there something deeper at play? He had been careful, methodical in his movements. This wasn't a moment of anger, it was premeditated. But why? Had he sought out an infected woman on purpose? Had he set this plan into motion knowing exactly what the outcome would be? Or had this been an act of pure opportunity, a way to destroy Tate from the inside out without ever raising a weapon? By September, Desmond Tate could no longer ignore the signs. He scheduled a routine checkup, expecting maybe a vitamin deficiency, maybe the lingering effects of an untreated flu. The results shattered his world. HIV positive. The words barely registered as the doctor spoke. His mind raced, trying to make sense of it. His wife, his only partner for the last 15 years, had tested negative. That fact alone told him everything he needed to know. This hadn't come from her. Someone had done this to him. Kiera Tate was devastated. She knew her husband. She knew the kind of man he was. And she knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that he had never been unfaithful. But if that was true, then how? The question loomed over them like a storm cloud, dark and suffocating. Meanwhile, Captain Malik Richardson, one of Tate's closest friends, had been watching everything unfold. He had seen Holloway's change in behavior. He had heard the whispers about the woman off base. And now, as he looked at the broken man in front of him, it all started to click. "Who's been around you?" Malik asked one evening. "Think, Des. Who's been close?" There was a long silence. Then, finally, Desmond exhaled. "Holloway." Holloway's dismissive attitude. At first, no one could prove anything. Holloway was careful. He never spoke openly. He never left a paper trail. And when questioned about the rumors, he only smirked. "Y'all believe everything you hear," he chuckled when someone brought it up in the barracks. "People need to mind their own damn business." But Malik wasn't letting it go. Holloway had always been cocky, but there was something about the way he carried himself now, an arrogance that hadn't been there before. Like he knew something no one else did. Like he was enjoying a private joke at everyone's expense. Desmond Tate was getting sicker. His body was failing him. And Holloway? He was watching. Waiting. Satisfied. Desmond Tate sat in his dimly lit office, his hands gripping the edge of the desk. His mind was racing. The diagnosis had already begun to reshape his life, but one thought overpowered all the others: this hadn't been an accident. This wasn't fate or bad luck. Someone had done this to him. And he had a strong suspicion about who. Late one evening, he called Captain Malik Richardson. "I need to tell you something." The conversation was heavy, filled with silences that stretched too long. Malik listened, his face unreadable, as Desmond explained the unexplainable. How he had always been faithful to Kiera. How the doctor had told him that, based on the progression of the virus, he had likely been infected within the last 6 months. It was Holloway. It had to be. Malik didn't hesitate. "You need to report this. Now." Desmond knew he was right. As much as he wanted to handle it quietly, to avoid the shame, the invasive questions, this wasn't just about him anymore. If Holloway had done this to him, what was stopping him from doing it to someone else? That same night, a formal complaint was filed. By morning, military medical officers were reviewing Desmond's records. A confidential investigation was launched. Within days, forensic specialists were assigned to trace potential sources of infection. The military didn't take allegations like this lightly. If what Tate suspected was true, this was an intentional act of harm, one that could have catastrophic legal and professional consequences. The first breakthrough came through digital forensics. Investigators combed through Holloway's phone records, searching for anything that might connect him to an HIV-positive source. What they found was chilling. There were text messages, dozens of them, between Holloway and a woman named Latrice Moore. Latrice was well known in parts of Fayetteville, though few in the military circles would have openly admitted to knowing her. She had a history. And more importantly, she was HIV positive. The texts weren't casual. They were calculated. Holloway, you sure it'll work? Latrice, long as you do what I said. Gotta be careful. It takes time, but it'll stick. Holloway, he won't even see it coming. The messages continued for weeks, discussing meetings, encounters, and instructions. The evidence was damning. Then came the final confirmation. When investigators brought Latrice in for questioning, she didn't hesitate. Yeah, he knew, she admitted. He wanted to make sure it would work. He kept asking me if there was a way to be sure. To be sure of what? An investigator asked. Her response sent a chill through the room. That he'd get it. That he'd never recover from it. When the truth was laid bare, Major Desmond Tate felt his body go cold. He had spent his entire career protecting the men under his command. He had risked his life alongside them. And one of them had deliberately destroyed his. It wasn't just the betrayal, it was the method. The patience. The cold, calculated nature of it. Holloway hadn't acted in a moment of rage. He had planned this for months. He had sought out the means, carried it out, and then sat back, watching as the virus did its work. Desmond could barely breathe as he processed it. This wasn't just revenge. This was something deeper. Something cruel. Meanwhile, news of the investigation spread like wildfire through Fort Bragg. Officers whispered behind closed doors. Soldiers exchanged glances in the mess hall, muttering Holloway's name under their breath. When word finally reached the higher ranks, the response was swift. A formal inquiry was launched. Holloway was pulled from duty. And for the first time since this nightmare had begun, Desmond Tate realized, there might still be a path to justice. The trial of Sergeant Xavier Holloway was unprecedented. The military justice system had seen its fair share of crimes, violence, theft, even murder, but this? This was something different. The charge, aggravated assault with intent to cause great bodily harm, a crime that carried severe penalties under the Uniform Code of Military Justice, UCMJ. But the prosecution wasn't stopping there. They argued that Holloway's actions were premeditated, that he had weaponized a disease in an act of revenge against a superior officer. It wasn't just about personal vengeance, it was a violation of military trust, an act that put lives at risk beyond just Major Desmond Tate. As the proceedings unfolded, damning evidence was presented. The text messages between Holloway and Latrice Moore, proving intent. Testimony from medical experts confirming that the timeline of Desmond's infection matched the alleged crime. Testimonies from fellow soldiers, who described Holloway's growing resentment toward Major Tate and his increasingly erratic behavior. Holloway sat motionless throughout the trial, his face unreadable. He didn't deny that he had been with Latrice. He didn't even deny that he was HIV positive. But when asked if he had intentionally infected Major Tate, he smirked. "Prove it," he muttered under his breath. The courtroom fell silent. But the prosecution didn't need his confession. The evidence spoke for itself. His sentence, was it enough? On October 21, 2018, the military court delivered its verdict. Guilty. The punishment? Dishonorable discharge, a permanent stain that stripped Holloway of his rank, his benefits, and his military pension. 30 years in military prison, one of the harshest sentences ever handed down for a nonviolent offense within the U.S. Army. For some, it was justice. For others, it wasn't nearly enough. Major Desmond Tate had been given life with his sentence. His marriage had crumbled under the weight of the betrayal. His career had ended, though not by choice. His body, once strong and unbreakable, was now fighting a silent battle every single day. And Holloway? Holloway would still have a chance to breathe free air again. Unanswered questions and lingering doubts. The case was closed. Holloway was convicted. Major Tate received the support of his fellow officers. The military implemented new health screenings to prevent something like this from happening again. But behind closed doors, there were whispers. Were there other victims? Investigators had found inconsistencies in Holloway's personal history. Rumors circulated that he had been involved with multiple sexual partners on base, both male and female. Had he infected others? If so, had they been too ashamed, or too afraid, to come forward? The Army never publicly acknowledged if further cases were found. Some believed the truth had been buried. Others feared that Holloway wasn't the only soldier who had ever used disease as a weapon. Impact on the military and beyond. The fallout from the case was massive. Stricter health screening policies were introduced across military bases, ensuring that service members received mandatory, routine testing for communicable diseases. Families of service members demanded better protections against targeted acts of harm within the ranks. The Department of Defense quietly reviewed its policies on how personal vendettas were handled in close-knit units. For Major Desmond Tate, the battle wasn't over. He became an advocate for awareness, using his story to educate others about the dangers of weaponized disease. But the scars, both physical and emotional, would never fully heal. And for many who served alongside him, one terrifying truth lingered. If Holloway could do this to his commanding officer, who else out there was capable of the same? The story of Sergeant Xavier Holloway and Major Desmond Tate is one of betrayal, calculated revenge, and a crime that shook the military to its core. But even with a conviction, so many questions remain. Now, we want to hear from you. Was justice truly served? Do you think Sergeant Holloway's punishment was severe enough for what he did? Should this crime have been classified as attempted murder instead of aggravated assault? And most importantly, do you believe the military handled this case the right way? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one. And if you want more shocking true crime cases that expose the darkest corners of human nature, make sure you subscribe. New episodes drop every week, and trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next.